Have you ever wondered what exactly is going on inside the minds of students when they are learning? Why do some things stick and others don't? Why are some students engaged in lessons and others aren't? In this video, I'm going to answer these questions for you with a brief overview of how learning happens in the brain. I will focus on the cognitive aspects now and address the social and emotional aspects in the next video, as well as some instructional strategies that are aligned to the learning sciences. Let's begin with a model of how information and experiences become memories. You may remember some of this from your Psych 101 class. It's important to remember that what I am going to show you is general and average for students, but there is quite a bit of variability in how this whole system works in each learner. It all begins with what is happening around the learner, the sensory stimuli. This could be anything perceived by our senses, such as hearing, touch, taste, etc., such as what the learner is reading or hearing people say, what the lighting is like, or how comfortable their chair is. All of this is information that makes its way into the brain through the sensory register into sensory memory. We don't actually absorb every single experience from all of our senses, so much of it is forgotten. It also only stays there for a very short time. What actually makes it into our conscious mind are the things that we are trying to pay attention to, whether it is because we are consciously directing our attention there, like trying to read a passage in a book, or because our attention is drawn to it, like a conversation nearby when we are trying to focus. Attention is interesting because it can also shape the information that is coming in from our sensory register so that we see things in a certain way or completely miss things we aren't expecting to see. Let's see an example of this.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted.
If you've never seen that before, it can be quite surprising that you actually did not even see a big gorilla walk across the screen, pause to beat his chest, and then walk on by. You were so focused on counting the balls and looking for people in white shirts that the gorilla did not register for you. Your attention system filtered out information that you thought was unnecessary. You'll want to think about helping your students to focus their attention on the right sensory input, otherwise they might completely miss what you are trying to teach them. Your conscious thoughts are in your working memory. This is a limited space, and we can only hold about 4 different things in mind at the same time. We can get around this limit by chunking content so that a group of related familiar items can make one chunk, or by comparing the new information with something the students already know by using metaphors. If we don't consciously process the information here in working memory through rehearsal in our visual or auditory loop, then it is forgotten. In order to store the things we are thinking about, we need to recall information from our long-term memory in order to find things we can connect it to. Another interesting thing to note is that we process visual and auditory information separately and simultaneously. This means that we can see a visual and hear about it and process both pieces of information at the same time. This works best for images and diagrams. If you have more than a word or two on the screen, then our brains read the words in our minds, probably like what you're doing now with the words in this graphic, using your auditory loop, making it unable to process other sounds, like my voice. This is why it can be so helpful to have visual information presented along with verbal information, and why you should not speak different words than what are on the screen at the same time, like I just did. You might need to rewind this part of the video to catch everything I said and process what is in the diagram. One of my favorite quotes from Daniel Willingham, a cognitive psychologist who wrote the book Why Don't Students Like School, is that memory is the residue of thought. The more you think about something, the more likely you are to remember it. By the way, this is a great book that has lots of good stories and practical tips for the classroom.
So now let's talk a little bit about how learning happens and why formative assessment is so important. So imagine over here is the outside world, classroom environment, teacher giving instruction, and then over here is the individual student. So the student inside their mind has two forms of memory. One is working memory, or what you're thinking about, and then the other is long-term memory, what we consider like our knowledge or like our lasting memories. So long-term memory would actually be inside the head, but there wasn't enough room in this graphic, so that's why it's floating on top. So when learning happens, it's what you're thinking about then gets solidified into your long-term memory. And that's what learning is. And then when we take that information out of long-term memory and think about it and bring it back into our working memory, then we're remembering. Now, to get new information into long-term memory, what happens is that we have to activate prior knowledge and make connections to what we already know. So it's not enough to just present information. The student actually has to make a connection in their mind to what they already know in order for that to go into their long-term memory. So that's why it's so important to activate prior knowledge and help students make personal connections to the content. That's how it gets into long-term memory and is remembered. Now, sometimes there are some distractors or some problems with that happening. So, for example, not paying attention, not being motivated, or having a cognitive overload. The student is thinking about too many other things, or they're confused by something. And when that happens, the information that comes in just goes right back out. It doesn't go into long-term memory. Now, another problem might be if there is no mental model. If the new information doesn't fit with what the student already knows, then it will also be forgotten. So that's why it's important to have some kind of background. When you try to learn something brand new and you have no experience, it can feel really overwhelming. It can feel like literally everyone is speaking Greek. So what was taught in this situation? So as the teacher, I taught these three topic areas. But the important question is what was learned? So you as the teacher, you know that you taught those three topic areas, but how do you know if the student learned them all? So the only way for that to happen is through formative assessment and feedback, where the student recalls that information through retrieval. And then once that information is outside the student, then you can see, hey, you know what? There were three topics here I taught, and the student only has one of them. So now I need to adjust my teaching by doing some remediation with that student, or helping them to make connections to what they already know, or helping them to be more motivated, or reduce the cognitive load, whatever you need to do for instructional interventions so that all of the topics are addressed. So another great thing about retrieval practice is that it doesn't just help with assessment, but every time something is retrieved, it gets stronger in the memory. So this is called the testing effect. It's really pretty interesting. It's just the act of retrieving something helps you to remember it better. So we call that retrieval practice. So that's another great reason for doing formative assessment. Not only does it help you to know what the student is learning, but it also helps the student to learn the information better because they're retrieving. So let's talk about learner variability, because this kind of model, this structure, is something that's common to all students, but we know that our students are individual learners. So here are some of the ways that your students will vary. One is in their sensory memory, so how that information moves into their working memory. And, so there might be some variability with vision ability, with a student being deaf or hearing impaired or having attention issues. So there are some sensory things that make each student unique. And then students have different amounts of working memory capacity. So this is often the case with students who have either learning disabilities or dyslexia or ADD. Their working memory capacity is a little bit smaller than the neurotypical child. This doesn't mean that they can't learn. It just means that you have to have smaller chunks and not so many at the same time. The other way that learners are unique is through their long-term memory. Every student has a different set of networks of mental models created inside their mind. So it's going to take a little bit of creativity to figure out how do you activate that for each learner. So hopefully this little explanation helps you to understand why formative assessment is so important.
Now let's talk a little about long-term memory, or what many people think of as our knowledge banks. What most people consider as memory is declarative or explicit memories, like episodes or events we have experienced. Your memories of your 21st birthday, a funny thing that happened at work, or a movie you watched are all examples of episodic memory. When we have lots of similar experiences, we naturally draw conclusions from them and form semantic memory, or what we think of as knowledge. This is typically what we are trying to build in our students when we teach them course content. We can build semantic memories by helping students see patterns and meaning in their episodic experiences. The more examples and context we can provide for our content, the easier it will be for students to make sense of our content, forming semantic memory that can be used in new situations. For example, instead of just showing students 3 of Van Gogh's famous works, describing them, and telling them the key features of his work, it can be much more effective for students to see several of his works and try to describe what they have in common. Even better, you can mix in works from other artists so that they can compare and contrast the works to develop rules in their mind about what makes Van Gogh's work unique. What are the essential characteristics of his work? Interestingly, the more intensely students think about the content through desirable difficulties, the stronger the memory will be. There is also non-declarative or implicit memory. This is the stuff that we know but don't think about, the things that have become automatic. These include skills and habits, priming, simple classical conditioning with the emotional and physical responses, and non-associative learning like habituation or sensitization. If I say 5 times 10, you immediately think of 50. You don't have to think about what those numbers represent and do any calculations. The answers become automatic for you. When you hear this music, you have an urge to clap your hands. It's an automatic response. The more we use semantic memory and repeat that information, the more automatic it becomes. This is why practice and recall are so important. An important goal we should have is to help our students to automate as many skills and decisions as possible, so that they don't take up any of that valuable limited working memory space, and they happen automatically. We can't talk about memory without talking about forgetting. About 150 years ago, a scientist named Hermann Ebbinghaus did an experiment on himself to find out how long it takes to forget something. He found that we remember things pretty well right away, but as time goes by, we tend to forget things pretty quickly. We want our students to remember what we teach them, so how do we help them not to forget? Do you remember what I said about getting things into long-term memory and helping them stay there? I mentioned retrieval practice, or the act of recalling something from your memory to think about it again. More recent research shows the effect this has on forgetting. If the information is retrieved a day later, you can see that it takes longer for it to be forgotten. If it is retrieved again a few days later, it takes even longer to be forgotten. And if it is retrieved again a few days later, it really sticks in long-term memory for a much longer time. Not only is practice important, but our brains struggle to remember something when it is nearly forgotten, which is a desirable difficulty. So if we try to remember it again the next day or a few days later, we strengthen that memory. Therefore, spacing out the practice over time is much more effective than doing all of the practice at once. Another desirable difficulty is recalling the information completely on your own, rather than recognizing it. Recognition is a weak memory trace, so forcing yourself to remember something without hints is much harder, but much more effective. Multiple choice questions can be much easier to grade, but fill in the blank or open-ended responses are more accurate measures of student learning. It also helps to mix up what we are practicing. This is another example of a desirable difficulty. Remember the Van Gogh example? We studied paintings by different artists mixed together, so we are better able to distinguish the unique characteristics of each artist, making categories in our minds. This is called interleaving. You can do this with any content, like comparing animal characteristics, practicing different types of math problems mixed up, or alternating different grammatical elements. Now, these are just the cognitive aspects of learning. There are numerous social and emotional aspects of learning that we will address in the next video, as well as some instructional strategies that are aligned with the learning sciences, or what we know about how learning happens.